Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night. Tonight's going to be the second part, and I have more than enough information to tell you. And so what I'm going to do is I will probably walk through some of it, but not go into quite the detail. If you remember last week, I gave you a great deal of history. I gave you a great deal of understanding of events that have led up to us becoming that second eagle head and the feathers that came with it. And now we're into the contrary feathers, which is chapter 12. In 11, we got the vision itself. Now here in 12, we're going to get the interpretation of this. Understand that the interpretation is not written in a chronological order. There's going to be a lot of space in between some of his answers. In fact, if you really wanted to get down to it, chapter 12, verses 23 to 28 really are the heart of his message. But we're going to see a lot of things that are going to go on. Now, again, this is from the Apocrypha. And remember, the Apocrypha is not in the New King James Bible. It is a books, 13 of them, that you're going to find between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you're going to a Catholic church, or if you're going to Ethiopian, it's a codex. There's lots of places that you're going to be able to find it. And if you can't find a Bible in your house that has it, you can go online. Esdras is printed for you online. You just have to fill in all the commentary that goes with it. I'm only going to do chapters 11 and 12. There's a chapter that deals with the Messiah. There's chapters that deal with the end, lots of other things. But I just wanted to give us an understanding of the United States and its role. And we are reaching the end of the role of the United States. As President Trump said yesterday night on the debate in talking, he says, our nation is in crisis. Our nation is going downhill. We are running into problems. And so as we go through this, I want you to understand that what he said was as prophetic as what the text that we're going to read about today. It's very much the same thing. Now, I'm going to give you chapter 12, but I'm also going to include, besides chapter 12, I'm going to include Daniel again. I'm going to include Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 11 and chapter 12. All of them are going to become very significant because Ezra, who says he wrote this section, Ezra himself believed that he was teaching the part that Daniel couldn't comprehend, that he and Daniel together have the entire understanding of the nations that lead up to the very end of days. And the end of days is not when all of a sudden heaven happens. The end of days comes at the point in time of the return of the Messiah, and God himself begins to flourish as we would know it in our atmosphere with us. So that's more towards the end. But tonight, I just want to focus on some of the things that are going to happen. And so please try to keep that in mind. I also, because, again, just for sharing purposes, I want to share with you. I hit it. Share. Technology. Okay, here we go. I want you to see chapter 11, but I'm really going to focus on chapter 12. So you'll have to go back and either look at my tape again, but we're really going to be focusing on chapter 12. So here we go. Now, chapter 12 begins, and it came to pass while the lion spake these words unto the eagle, I saw and behold the head that remained, and the four wings appeared no more. And the two went unto it and set themselves up to reign. And their kingdom was small and filled with uproar. Now, understand, first off, the lion itself, as we'll see later on, represents the Messiah, represents Israel. It's the Israel that's talking to this eagle, and he's identifying for them. Now, what the eagle is looking like at this point in time is down to the last head. two heads have already happened, which we talked about. The first head was the head that was Great Britain. It was the one that was the biggest, it lasted the longest. The second head represented the United States, and the United States head is beginning to dissipate. And now we're at the end, and the third head is now in front of us. And not only is he in front of us, but those last feathers are in front of us. Now, Daniel adds to this story because he begins to talk to us or teach us about the fact of, in chapter 7, he's going to talk to us a lot about this fourth beast that doesn't look like any kind of animal that's ever been seen. And we'll get into those parts as we go along. Before we get there, I want you to remind yourself, in Daniel chapter 2, we saw the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his visions and in his dreams. We saw that the top was Nebuchadnezzar. We saw that the silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire. We saw that the copper represented Greece. And we saw that eventually the bottom part represented Rome, or the Roman era. And then we got to the feet, and the feet themselves were still a part of that iron because it was iron mixed with pottery clay. So it was not as strong. And we also have to notice that they said 2 feet, indicating there was a separation. And in the beginning of the Roman Empire, it was one empire. But then again, as Constantine rolled to the surface and became Caesar, he began to change the whole thing. He moved the entire kingdom's capital city to Constantinople, a city that he had taken over, and it became, that's the place where it was at. And so we're going to talk our way through this. Now, since it's mixed with clay, that's a substance not nearly as strong. Again, when we went to Daniel chapter 7, and you'll have to go back to my tapes, I think I have 5 recordings that go along with this. And I believe it's the second one that you're actually going to listen to, which deals with those 4 empires also had 4 modern nations that could also be identified that way. And so what we're looking at is something that is repeating itself. And we're looking at something inside something else as we go through our story. But understand that this third head turns into a small kingdom. Now, that doesn't mean it is tiny. In fact, what I think it means, and what I'm going to tell you I believe it means, it's dealing with people who orchestrate the run of the world. Now, this is not a nation. This is a small group that are in charge. If you want to use a word in the United States that President Trump uses, you simply call it the second state, you call it the deep state, you call it whatever you will, but it's people who are not elected, not voted in or anything else. They now run the country from behind. And so we'll go back through that. If you go through my lesson last week, you're going to understand all that I've just said to you. Now, the third verse goes on to say, and I saw and behold, they appeared no more. And the whole body of the eagle was burnt, so that the earth was in great fear. So the eagle is no longer in charge. Understand that. As we've looked through these last 3 years, as you look across the world, you ask yourself the question, who's in charge? Who runs what's going on in the world today? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it Iran? Is it North Korea? It doesn't look like it's the United States. Europe wonders who's in charge. There are a great number of nations. Saudi Arabia wonders who's in charge because they're now beginning to have conversations with Russia looking for help. So there's a lot of things going on. It's a very nebulous time. A time of great fear. We fear right now the idea of a third world war. Now, it goes on to say, then awakened I out of the trouble and trance of my mind. And from great fear, I said to my spirit, lo, this has thou done unto me, in that thou searchest out the ways of the highest. Ezra is now trying to really dig in and understand what he's watching, because he himself is becoming as fearful as the people will be at the end of days. He is finding turbulence within him. He is struggling with this whole thing. Daniel struggled. Remember, Daniel prayed for 21 days looking for an answer. Finally, the answer, Gabriel, got through, but that was only by the help of Michael the archangel, because they fought against what was called the Prince of Persia. Now, the Prince of Persia is not a human. It was an angelic being that actually was the version of, well, let me go back. I used to teach the Old and the New Testament. When I taught the New Testament, I taught Ephesians chapter 6. In Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about the fact we war not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. Those powers, those are angelic powers. This Prince of Persia is an angel that has denied Gabriel the opportunity to get through. If it wasn't for Michael, he would have never made it. So he's in fear. He's struggling with what's going on. And as he's struggling with that, so is Ezra. Now it goes on in verse 5 to say, lo, yet I am weary in my mind and very weak in my spirit, and little strength is there in me. For the great fear wherewith I was afflicted this night. Understand, that's the fear that's going to come upon the world. It'll be a great fear. Now, does that mean we all have to live cowardly lives? Does that mean we have to withdraw? Do we have to declare everything as hopeless? And the answer is no. We have God. No matter what happens, God is still in charge. It just looks like he's left us and there's nobody helping us. But understand, God is there. Well, I finished teaching on Sunday mornings the book of Job. And one of the things that Job faced was the fact that he felt like God had left him, that he had no one to go to. That's the feeling I get that Ezra had. But again, in the end, Ezra and Job both understand God is in charge and that he will be there at the end. In verse 7, it says, and I said, Lord, that bearest rule, if I had found grace before thy sight, and if I am justified with thee before many others, and if my prayer indeed become up before thy face, comfort me then. Show me thy servant the interpretation and the plain difference of this fearful vision, that you mayest perfectly comfort my soul. Isn't that what we want when we study the Bible? We want to be comforted. And that's not saying that we're weak. It's just that we want to know. Now, sometimes it's better that we didn't know. But when we do get to this point, we just hope God is there to help us through that. Well, verse 9 goes on to say, for thou hast judged. Let me hit it. God has judged, or thou hast judged, which is God, me worthy to show me the last times. So he understands that God hasn't left him, and he understands that God has appointed him for this one purpose. Sometimes I wonder if I was appointed for the purpose of talking about this or whether I'm just picking it up on my own. But I want you to understand, whether I'm doing it for personal glory or whatever, that it's really not for that. It's about giving everybody a last opportunity to begin to understand what's going on. Verse 10 says, and he said unto me, this is the interpretation of the vision. So now we're getting into the interpretation. The eagle whom thou sawest come up from the sea is the kingdom which was seen in the vision of thy brother Daniel. Now, Daniel's vision came up in chapter 7. Out of the sea means from the Gentile world. Israel is the land, Gentiles are the sea. Now, this is a kingdom, the eagle. If we go back to chapter 7, we don't have an eagle by itself per se, but we have a lion with eagle's wings. The eagle's wings were plucked from the lion, and therefore the lion stood up and became like a man. but we never really finish what happened with the eagle. And that's the part that Ezra is now playing for us. He's letting us understand where it all went. And he doesn't give us all of it, because you see, he's going to pick up this story with Herbert Hoover. Now, most of us remember maybe the name Herbert Hoover, that he was president, but we have very little understanding of what he did or why he is the one he starts with. But we'll get that as we go along. But it was not expounded unto him, and therefore now I declare it unto thee. Behold, the days will come that there shall rise up a kingdom upon the earth, and it shall be feared above all the kingdoms that were before it. And in the same shall 12 kings raise one after another. Now, as we look at this, we're going to have to understand the metaphors that are involved in this. We know that the eagle is the United States, but the three-headed eagle doesn't make sense unless we go back in time, back to the 14th, 15th century. You see, in about the 14th, 15th century, Great Britain was the magnificent eagle. He dominated the world. After the battle, the Spanish Armada, there was no one to challenge the eagle, Great Britain. It was found across the world. In fact, we said that the sun never set on the British Empire. So it was something that was long and across the world. But we said again that the eagle had its feathers plucked. So the first eagle is going to the first head is going to represent Great Britain, which ruled the longest. The second one is going to be the United States, which is now coming to its end. I want you to understand, it's coming to its end. It's not at the end. It's coming towards the end. This is the last part. There's a third head that's going to be showing up as we get further into the text. But understand that there are three heads to this eagle, and this eagle has feathers. And last time I talked about the 12 feathers, and we talk about the 8 contrary feathers. Well, he begins in verse 14. He says, in the same shall 12 kings reign one after another. Those were the feathers. There were 12 of them. Now, the second one, according to verse 15, whereof the second shall begin to reign and shall have more time than any of the 12. Well, if we go back in history in the United States, what president ruled longer? I shouldn't say he ruled, although that would be an appropriate term for what's going to happen. What president was in charge longer than any of the other presidents? George Washington quit at the end of 2. And he said the reason is because I didn't want to become king. I didn't want the nation to become king, because you see, the nation was built to be a republic where every man counts and where the majority does not have rule over the minority. Everyone counts. Well, it wasn't until World War II that we began to see, actually before that, we began to see a president who ruled what turned out to be 3.5 terms. Would have been 4, except that he passed away, and Harry S. Truman finished out his term. But understand, as we're going through this, when we look specifically at what's going on, understand that this kingdom then is built with 12 feathers. But wait a second. If it's only built with 12 feathers, what do you do? Because you see, Bill Clinton would have been the 12th feather. What about George Bush? What about Barack Obama? What about Donald Trump? And now today, what about Joe Biden? Where are they at on this whole thing? Well, we know that the 12 kings ruled one after another, according to verse 14, that the second one ruled the longest. And this do the 12 wings signify. Now, he went from calling them feathers to calling them wings. I'm not sure whether that's an interpretation problem when it was translated from the original language, because you see, we don't have the original manuscript. All we have are those that have been copies. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about copies. There are 2 ways in which scriptures have been copied. One is the Hebrew way, where a person begins to scribe out. He puts the first letter on the right-hand side in the top line and the last letter of the first line. Then he goes to the middle and he puts the middle letter in. Then he goes to the bottom, and at the bottom right-hand side, he'll put the last letter. And on the left-hand side, or on the right-hand side, the first letter, and the left-hand side will be the last letter. And then he begins by filling it in. And he talks to himself as he does this. When we made the New Testament, and you'll find out that there's a great number of problems with the New Testament, it was done in a scriptorium. A scriptorium is where they had a person read the text, and 50 men were sitting in the room copying what they heard. What kind of errors can you get doing it that way? That's the problem that happens with the New Testament. We don't know how this book of Ezra was done, which may account for some errors. But as we go on, I want you to understand that these 12 feathers are the 12 wings that he's talking about. 17 goes on to say, after the voice which thou heardest speak, and that thou saw not to go out from the heads, but from the midst of the body, therefore, or thereof, this is the interpretation. So now we have this beast, this feathery bird, now talking, but not from its mouth. The words are coming from the body. If you look around the United States today, you hear a lot of different voices being raised. Lots of confusion, lots of hate, lots of separation, lots of conversations of, I will bring the nation back together and everybody will like each other. That's not going to happen. It's going to be one of those times when all of the people are going to be talking. And as they talk, they're all going to have different voices. I shouldn't say all will have different voices, but there will be a great number of conversations. If you went to Congress today, just the House of Representatives, how many parties do we actually have? Well, we got the Democrats and the Republicans. Everybody knows that. Well, wait a second. Is Bernie Sanders a Democrat? I thought he was an independent. Not only did I think he was an independent, but wait a second. He's also a socialist, because you see, that's what he advocates. AOC advocates the same thing. So we have a socialist group that calls themselves the progressives. So now we have the Democrats, we have the progressives, and we have what's called, very few are left, are the blue dog Democrats. Well, then we got just the Republicans against all these other groups. No, wait a second. The same thing holds true on the other side. You understand that even our government doesn't talk with one voice. Now, verse 18 goes on to say that after a time of the kingdom, there shall arise great strivings. Can you feel it? And it shall stand in peril of failing. Can you feel it? Nevertheless, it shall not fall. Can you hear it? It shall not fall. Understand that. Everything that's going on in this world does not make sense. God told us that it shall not disappear, the eagle. Now, it's not going to look like it did, but it's not going to fail. It's not going to fall, but shall be restored again in this beginning. If you go back to Daniel chapter 7, you will begin to look at the beasts that are listed there, and they all have one thing in common. There's a verse that tells us that they will all be here at the end of days, just like we will be here at the end of days. Verse 19 says, and whereas thou sawest the 8 small under feathers sticking to her wings, this is the interpretation. So now we're going to talk about the 8. Now, the 8 would have to include George Bush, Barack Obama. It would have to include Donald Trump. It'll have to include Joe Biden. And because you see, there's something happening. Look at verse 20. that in him there shall arise 8 kings, whose time shall be but small, and their years swift. Now, their times will be smaller because of the fact that we begin to lose control of our power. We are not the dominating nation we once were. We will have periods of time where we are, but not the same. Now it goes on to say, and 2 of them shall perish in the middle time approaching. 4 shall be kept until their end begins to approach, but 2 shall be kept unto the end. So 2 are going to perish shortly, 4 are going to make it, and 2 shall be there at the end. But watch what will happen to the last 2. Verse 22. Whereas thou sawest 3 heads resting, and this is their interpretation, in the last days, not the end of days, the last days. Now, the last days can begin, and I believe back in the 14th, 15th century with Great Britain. Those were the last days. That's the empire that we've been following with the eagle. Shall the Most High raise up 3 kingdoms and renew many things therein, and they shall have dominion of the earth. So in the last days, there's going to be 3 kingdoms, just like there's 3 heads. Each kingdom will be renewed. Each kingdom will have a dominion over the earth. And those that dwell therein, in verse 24, with much oppression of all those that were before them. Therefore are they called the heads of the eagle. For these are they that shall accomplish his wickedness. Notice, even the United States, notice the language. For these are they that shall accomplish his wickedness. Does that mean the entire nation of the United States is wicked? No, but we will be accomplishing that wickedness that is spoken of here. It's just as though there are days when you and I do make mistakes. Never believed I did, but my wife reminds me of those. But as we go through this, we're going to understand the fact that these nations will be judged eventually on what happens. And above all those that were before them, therefore they are called the heads of the eagle. Verse 25, for these are they that shall accomplish his wickedness, and that shall finish his, whose end? Whose last day? Well, if you go by Ezekiel, that would be Gog and Magog. If you were a New Testament Christian, you would say it's the Antichrist. I choose to think it's not any of those, but I'll tell you my opinion later. Now, and whereas thou sawest that the great head appeared no more, it signified that one of them shall die upon his bed, and yet with pain. This is where you need your history lesson. The one that's going to be the great head is the head in the middle. The head in the middle was the first to rise, so that's Great Britain. Now, who was it that died upon his bed in great pain? The answer is King George VI. King George VI, and he did so in the year 1952. 1952. Now, as we go through understanding what happened in time, understand that 1952 was a very significant time. And by that, I mean a great number of events occurred that nobody noticed. But that's not hard to understand because we tend to do that. We tend to lose track of, we tend to lose track of things that, they just don't seem to, it didn't bother me, it didn't touch me. So it's certainly not something that I had to worry about. And so we're beginning to understand in 1952, a lot of things happened. 1952, president was elected. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Actually, 1952 was when he came to his end. But before he left, he wrote a speech. He had it from the Oval Office, sitting at his desk. It was 10 minutes long. Now, I'm not going to read the whole 10-minute speech, but I want you to hear these verses. or this length. Before World War II, the United States had no armament industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency provisions of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. And we did that. Of the 5 leading industrial armament makers, 4 of them reside in the United States. 4 out of the 5. The 5th one is the Krupp organization in Germany. Everything else, Lockheed and all the rest, are here in the United States. He goes on to say, added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment industry. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all the United States corporations. Now, in conjunction of an immense military establishment, a large arms industry is new in the American experience. A total influence, economic, political, and even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every house of the federal government. We recognize the imperative needed for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, our resources, our livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the Council of Government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. This is part of the 3rd head. He goes on to say, we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Did you hear his fear? The fear that we become a nation that was dependent upon military armaments. In fact, from the days of Dwight D. Eisenhower on, we became the police force of the world. Last night, Kamala Harris, in talking, says that we don't have any soldiers in harm's way. Do you know that we have 70 military bases that have been shot at recently? 70? We do have people in harm's way. We have them everywhere. We have become everybody's help. Now, remember, after World War II, remember the Greatest Generation. After that, we had another war. That was the Korean War. And after that, we had the Vietnam War. And after that, we had the war with Iraq. And after that, do you hear what I'm saying? War seems to be part of where we're coming from. But notice the results of the wars. Did you notice? We don't win them. We spend millions of dollars, lose millions. We lose our treasures. And yet at the same time, when it's all said and done, nothing changes. As we go on to this, I went too fast a little bit. Let me back up. For the 2 that remain shall be slain with the sword. Both of them will eventually go. For the sword of the one shall devour the other. The sword of the one shall devour the other. So there's 2 eagles' heads. One of the heads will devour the other head, meaning there will only be one left. But at the last shall he fall through his sword himself. And whereas thou sawest 2 feathers under the wings passing over the head that is on the right side, it signified that these are they who the highest hath kept until the end. This is the small kingdom, full of trouble, as thou sawest. So the smallest kingdom comes out of the United States. But it didn't start here. You see, the smallest kingdom actually started in the days of Great Britain. It actually started when the financial ways became the most expensive ways. And the King of England had to borrow so much money to keep his army going and his fleet flowing that they became indebted to what will become the next small empire, the Rothschilds. You see, the Rothschilds basically began to rule all the banks of Europe. Not only did they rule the banks of Europe, they also created the currencies for Europe, and they also took money from them in order to create the currency. So you were being taxed before you were being taxed. 1915, 16, the United States, Woodrow Wilson created the income tax in order to help finance World War I. He said after World War I happens, we'll do away with it. It never happened. It's only grown since then. So we're looking at an empire that's financial with the Rothschilds. But you see, the Rothschilds aren't the only ones. They're only part of the group, but they are also the richest of the group. Because you see, they not only control the banks of Europe, but they also control the banks in multiple nations. And by the way, they control our Federal Reserve System. They control our banks. We are beholden to them. Now, there were two presidents that tried to do something about it, but both of them didn't make it. The easiest one to understand is, well, John F. Kennedy. He was shot, remember, in that motor vehicle accident by Saddam or Saran? No, who was it? I can't think of his name right now. My mind is going too fast. Let me slow down.
Sirhan.
That was the one that did Robert Kennedy.
Oh, yeah, I thought that's who you're talking about. Okay,
yeah,
you're talking
it's
about
the one that
Lee Harvey
Oswald.
Yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah. Now, he was the one that supposedly shot him from the bookstore, the book depository. But actually, they say that that's not exactly where he got the bullet from. But anyway, we'll go back beyond that. Why was he shot? He was shot simply because he created a new $5 bill, not through the federal government, but he established his own printing company. And the money was backed by the Federal Reserve. I don't know if you ever notice your notes now make no comment about what's backing your dollar bill. It used to be a silver certificate, but that's not there anymore. We just have green paper. But that's another story. Let me continue, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So, for the sword of the one shall devour the other. That sword is going to be the sword of the Rothschilds, the sword of the military-industrial complex, the sword of the small group, the deep state, if you will. But at the last shall he fall through the sword himself. Now, whereas thou sawest two feathers under the wings passing over the head, that is on the right side, it signified that these are they whom the highest hath kept unto the end. And this is the small kingdom and full of trouble thou sawest. So these last two heads are going to be the worst of the heads, and they're going to bring everything to a total end. But remember, what was the objective of the Rothschilds? What's the objective of the deep state? Control of the world. We're back to the days of Nimrod, the idea of a one world society. Now it goes on to say in 31, and the lion whom thou sawest rising up out of the woods and roaring and speaking to the eagle and rebuking her for her unrighteousness will be with all the words that thou hast heard. This is the anointed, which the highest hath kept for them and for the wickedness unto the end. And he shall reprove them and shall upbraid them with their cruelty. God will eventually chasten them. Now, the voices came from the lion, came from the Messiah, which brings me to the second question: which Messiah? Because you see, in Jewish understandings, there's two of them. Oh, wait a second, I misspoke. The word Messiah simply means anointed. There was an anointed Persian king named Cyrus. He was given the anointing so that he could send Israel back to their land. Then there was also 38 times when the high priest was identified as being the Messiah, the anointed one. So the anointed one could be lots of different people. It could be a prophet. Will God raise a prophet in the end days? Will there be somebody who will be the harbinger for God? That is what I'm looking for. Now, I finished these, but I didn't change them. So we'll have to read them in red. For he shall send them before him alive in judgment. Who's he going to send before end to judgment? Alive? The small feathers, the last kingdom. He shall rebuke them and correct them. Now, for the rest of my people shall he deliver with mercy. Understand there will people who will live through this whole thing. Please understand, I don't believe in the rapture. Please understand that my understanding of Thessalonians was something that happened in the days of Caesar's, and that was those people believed that God had already come and gone. So rapture isn't part of what I'm understanding. Some of us, maybe even many of us, will go through the hard times. But as we go through, please remember that you are valued by God, and he will deliver you with his mercy. Now, those who have been pressed upon my borders, and he shall make them joyful until the coming of the day of judgment. So there's going to be something about us that will be different. We won't be looking at all the gloom and doom because we will have an unspeakable joy. Unspeakable. Now, this is the dream that thou sawest, and these are the interpretations. Thou only hast been meet to know this secret of the highest. I'm not very good on my King's English. Actually, they're not very good with me. But anyway, back to the story. Therefore, write all these things that thou hast seen in a book. And what do you do with the book? You hide it. Well, why are you going to hide a book that's got all of this information in it? Just as he told Daniel, go your way. Go your way. This isn't going to happen for a long time yet. But even though you hide the book, I want you to teach them to the wise of the people. There are going to be some of us, I'm not including myself, but there are going to be some of us with such wisdom that they will be able to capture the understanding that is here. I'm not the only one who's written on the book of on the three eagle heads. I'm only one voice of many that I found on, but mine is a little bit different than everybody else's. So you can take it for what it's worth, and you can go look at the others, and maybe that will be more pleasing in your ear. But towards the end, it now begins to seem like we can begin to understand what's going on. And therefore, the wise are now going to start teaching it. Verse 38 says, and teach them to the wise of the people whose hearts may comprehend and keep these secrets. In Jewish understanding, words of prophecy were passed one to one for the most part. There were only 55 prophets written into the Talmud or into the Bible. But there were thousands of people who were prophets, who had individual messages for individual people or small groups, who never found their writings to be listed among the true prophets of the Bible. But that doesn't mean they weren't prophets. 39 says, but wait thou here thyself yet 7 days more, that it may be shown to thee whatsoever it pleases the highest to declare unto thee. With that, he went his way. Who went his way? Well, we could say Ezra went his way, but we could also say whoever was speaking to him said he went his way. Because you see, that's what happened to Gabriel and after Daniel was given the message. But again, verse 40 says, and it came to pass when all the people saw that the 7 days were past. In other words, this message required days to give. So what we have here is a snapshot of the message. We don't have the whole thing. We have what Ezra, what Ezra can remember. And I not come again into the city. They gathered them all together, for the least to the greatest, and came unto me and said, what have we offended thee? And what evil have we done against thee, that thou forsakest us and sittest here in this place? Ezra is waiting there for somebody to come back, somebody to finish whatever he started. And so he sits there, and now all of the people are now coming to him and asking, why didn't you come back and tell us? Verse 42 goes on to say, for all of the prophets, thou art less us, art left us, as a cluster of the vintage, as a candle in a dark place, and even as a haven or a ship preserved for the tempest. The people clung to Ezra. He was what they thought their last hope. He was their connection with God, just like Moses was the connection for the people when he was with them in the wilderness. Verse 43 says, are not the evils which are come to us sufficient? In other words, do we have to borrow trouble for what's at the end of the days? Isn't there enough problems now? Couldn't we say that same thing right now? If it's going to get worse, why do I want to borrow those problems and bring them on down to me now? Let me live with what I've got, but understand what's about to come. Verse 46 or 44, if thou shalt forsake us, how much better had it been for us if we also had been burned in the midst of Zion? He's talking about the Roman pillaging of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. You see, not everybody died there. It was horrible. Many people were sold into slavery. Many people did escape. Many people were still left behind, but it still was not enough. Shouldn't it have been better that all of us Jews died there? No. 45 says, for we are not better than they that died there. And they wept with a loud voice. Then answered I them and said, be of good comfort, O Israel. Be not heavy, thou house of Jacob. For the highest hath you in remembrance, and the mighty hath not forgotten you in temptation. God is still with us. Do not forget, no matter what's going on in your life, no matter what's happening, you're not going through it alone. God is there. He goes on to say, as for me, I have not forsaken you, neither am I departed from you, but I am come into this place to pray for the desolation of Zion. So he is praying, maybe even at the Temple Mount, for what had already happened. I remember the story of Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the great rabbis of his day. He and some of his disciples went up on the Temple Mount, and the Temple Mount had been totally destroyed, burnt everything. And Akiva looked and he saw a fox running across the Temple Mount, which would have been something that would have been profane. But when he saw it, he laughed. His disciples said, well, what are you laughing about? This is all destroyed. And he says, yes, but it will be rebuilt again because God will restore what has been lost. And that I might seek mercy for the low estate of your sanctuary. And now go your way home, every man, and after these days I will come unto you. So the people went their way into the city, like as I commanded them. But I remained still in the field 7 days. And the field, the Temple Mount was identified 3 different ways. If you remember, Abraham saw the Temple Mount, and that's where he took Isaac. And as you remember, Jacob, when he was laying there outside the city, he looked up and saw the stairway leading to heaven. But there was one who was out in the field. Now, we don't know where the field was, because that's not told to us. But remember, the last time we had seen him, he was on the same mount where Abraham had just sacrificed him. But now he was walking in the field. He was walking in the area of the Temple Mount. That's where he met Rebecca. So he goes on to say after this, so the people went their way into the city, like as I commanded them. But I remained still in the field 7 days, as the angel commanded me, and did eat only those days of the flowers of the field, and had my meat of the herbs. He had a vegan diet. The point is, at the end, he followed what God wanted him to follow, which is something that you and I have to do as we go through Parsha readings. Tomorrow, Rod will be speaking and he'll be sharing with us the Parsha. And as he shares the Parsha, understand he's sharing God's word. He's giving us what we need because that's what the Parsha does. It gives us what we need. Oftentimes, it'll even match up with what's going on in the world or in our lives. Always listen to hear what's going on. Always read to see if there's something special in there for you. I've talked for 53 minutes now, so I guess I'm done. I did not tell you all of my notes. If you're interested in all of the history background that I have, actually took me 22 pages to write this lesson out. You can simply email me at Steve Ambrani, which is my name right there, all in low letters, all together, at gmail.com. And I'd be glad to send you. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them for you, if I can. I think I understand what's gone on in this 2 chapters, and I hope I gave you something to think about. If I gave you nothing else, please remember God is with you. Shalom. Any questions? Any thoughts?